So I'm very excited about having Pastor Carel Smith, Dr. Willie McLeod on the podcast again today. And as you guys know, this is a bit of a joint venture between the Bible GPS and Core Ideas. What we're going to do today is basically sort of pull together a lot of discussion points that we've had in previous podcasts. And I would actually like to call this Abram Holds the Key. I think sort of the direction we're going to take is, why is it essential to know and understand Abram and how it leads to a better understanding of Genesis. But I want to start off asking Willie about the Sumerian hypothesis. What is the Sumerian hypothesis? How does it impact our understanding of Genesis? And, sort of how we sort of reflect on everything in Genesis. Willie.
Yeah, Labai. So I think what is important in this discussion about Abram is that Abram is a central figure in the book of Genesis. By far the most information in the book of Genesis turns around the life of Abram. He's a primary figure in the history of Israel in terms of the literary tradition. And what is interesting is that Abram's story is directly after the primeval history. So we first have the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11. Then we have Abram's story, and then the other two patriarchs. But Abram is the dominant figure, by far the dominant figure in the story. Now, what is important is that Abram, he forms the link between the primeval history and the later patriarchal history. His own story and that of the other fathers. So he's the link. And we read that he came from Sumer. Now, in the Bible, it's been called Shinar. So the masses in the south of Mesopotamia, that was in that area, that the land or the ancient civilization of Sumer was to be found. And one of the main cities, especially during the final part of the civilization, when they ruled quite a large empire, was Ur, the city of Ur. Now, Abram came a little bit later, but he came from the same city. So he would have known not only quite a lot about the Sumerians that had gone before, but his family had been living there for a very long time. We left that it was the land of his fathers. So they've lived in this country. Semites had been living in Sumer for centuries and centuries. In fact, there was a period late in the 3rd millennium BC when the Semites ruled not only Sumer, but the whole world. The whole of the known world was ruled by Semites. It's called the Akkadian Empire. The Semites had been present from the earliest of times, and I think we've mentioned that before. So his family was present in Mesopotamia for a very long time. So from Sumer and from Ur, that was the city of Abram also, according to the Bible. That was the city where he was located. And then from there, he traveled all the way along the Euphrates River through the city of Mari. We'll come back to the city of Mari, which is more or less quite a distance towards the north, but more in the middle zone. And then eventually he turned and came to Haran. And then from Haran, he came to the land of Canaan. And there was a famine, so he actually moved directly to Egypt. So that's the story of Abram.
So, Willie, can I just, so it's correct for me to say that it's actually not proper to understand Abram purely in terms of Jewish tradition, but that we have to look at, his origins and the culture that actually brought with him.
Yeah, that's a very important point. For most Bible believing Christians, and I would even say also for Jews, to a very large extent, Hebrew tradition starts with Abram. So they sort of begin with Abram in their story. But the biblical story do not begin with Abram. It begins long before Abram. So the reason why we neglect the earlier periods and the earlier tradition is because we would, for example, read in the end of the book of Joshua that the fathers worshipped other gods while they were living in Sumer, in Ur. So that was, for most biblical Christians and Jews, that early period was a period of heathenness, of the heathens. That was before God called Abram. And for them, that's sort of the dark ages of biblical history. That's a part, that's before the story starts. And in my view, this is not correct. The story of God does not start in his relation with man, does not start with Abram. It starts long before that. Although Abram is obviously a very important figure. So Abram is the link. He is the link between Sumer and the earlier traditions that had been delivered down for centuries and had been brought to the land of Canaan. So I believe he's the link. So that's the reason why the primeval history, which for the most part plays off in Sumer, in the land of Sinai, it's directly before his story. So I believe that his family, they brought these stories with them when they came from Mesopotamia and traveled and settled in Canaan.
Beautiful. And I think for people that haven't listened to us before, it's really important to realize that there's very strong synergies between Sumerian, can I say, history and what we see in early biblical tradition as well. And it's very prominent. Can you sort of expand on a couple of points that sort of relates to that?
Yeah, so we've discussed quite a few things. We've discussed the creation story right in the beginning. We started with that actually in the series. And we saw that in the creation story, Genesis 1, there's a lot of stuff that comes from a Sumerian background. So the author, his background was a Sumerian, but the story had been rewritten and regrouped in various ways. But the background information and the terminology and the concepts and so on, that's very old. That comes from ancient Sumer. We found the same with the garden story. We discussed the garden story, various elements of the garden story. We discussed Enoch. We discussed the deluge. We discussed the Tower of Babel. All these things have an equivalent in the Sumerian tradition. So what we have are two parallel traditions going back to those earliest of times when these things in fact happened. So I argue that these are based on real events that happened in that land in early periods. And it had been handed down, and it had been handed down in two civilizations, two traditions. The one is the Sumerian tradition, and later on the Babylonian tradition, and the other one is the Hebrew tradition. And that's why these two traditions had such a lot that correspond. And we have discussed each of these different aspects of the primeval history. So that's the background. How did these stories enter the Bible? Because there's a lot of Mesopotamian material. Once you start studying it, you'll see there's a lot of Mesopotamian material in the primeval history. The primeval history, that's Genesis 1 to 11. And where does it come from? It comes, in my view, from Abraham having been brought it from the land of Sumer.
Yeah. I think the next question that then sort of, so we talk about Sumerian tradition, moving into early biblical tradition, but Carel had a question when we had that initial discussion around Abraham as a historical figure or the historicity of Abraham. Carel, did you want to ask a question or sort of expand on that?
Thanks, Levi. Yeah, I can maybe just make a few comments about Abraham. He's indeed a very interesting figure. And as I was turning through the Bible, preparing for our discussion, I saw that it was actually Abraham's father, Terah, who moved from Ur to Haran. And yeah, and then from there, you read in Haran, God called him to go to Canaan. And oftentimes we think that it all just started there when God revealed himself to Abraham, but it seemed to go further back. And Willie, as you mentioned, there are a lot of evidence that God was present also in that very early Sumer tradition. And there are a lot of traces in the Bible about God revealing himself in small ways, you can say. But now what you've mentioned, Lebay, about the historicity of Abraham, scholars differ a lot about this. Some scholars believe, as we have mentioned, that the Babylonian hypothesis who say that says all these stories about Abraham only was the people created it in the when they were in Babylon in the exile. But Willie, what is real interesting for me when I read your article, there seemed to be some real proof in the things that happened around Abraham, the things in history, even in the Bible, things are written about invasion of the Elamites. And, if we have enough proof that these things actually happened, which were mentioned in the Bible, then there are strong evidence that this is not just, stories which came later, but that it actually happened in these early times. So maybe, Willie, you can mention something about, some proof in history or in the politics or, in things that happened around Abraham that actually prove that he was a real figure and that he actually lived in those times.
And perhaps as it relates to the Septuagint as well. Interesting.
I can just mention that what you have actually said is quite interesting. In a certain sense, as I've already said, many Christians, for them the story starts with Abram. But when one reads the primeval history, that period before Abram, we read that God was active in that ancient world. He was involved. The story of Adam and Eve, he was involved in that early period. The story of Enoch, of the Tower of Babel, of the deluge. God was not only aware, God was involved, actively involved in all those things. So I think it's important that the story of God and this relationship does not start with Abram. So with Abram, there's a new phase, and there's definitely a totally new revelation of God, of himself, and this new covenant with Abram. It's a new phase in God's relation, but we should not neglect God's relation and the way that he revealed himself. And as you've said, the traces thereof in ancient history. And we'll come back and talk about the Jewish God, the God that we believe in at a later stage. But at this stage, it's important, I believe, to see this continuity. And, this also explains how this information has entered the book of Genesis. Now, regarding Abram, he is a fascinating figure. In present day, biblical criticism scholarship, they're not taking Abram serious. They believe that he's not an historical person. And I've read some articles, trying to explain how the story originated in the Exilic or post-Exilic period, the Persian period, for example, about 300 years before Christ. And they have amazing ideas, about how the story could have originated. So it was made up, in their view, at that late stage for various reasons and so forth. Now, obviously, they can't prove it, but all that they need is to present an alternative to the biblical story, and to do it in such a way that scholars are a strange kind of species. Anything new and strange, that's interesting to them. The old stuff, the stuff that we know, that's not interested. They're not that interesting. They're not so interested in that. And that's why they run after these kind of strange new views and stuff. There's absolutely no historical proof for that. But, they formulate tales and stories, and they try to make sense of it in this late period and how it originated. And some of the, I believe most of the scholars, biblical scholars, that's also scholars of the ancient world at our universities, actually believe this, that it was late. Abraham was not an historical figure. So
and it's Willie, that's where the risk comes in. You see it a lot nowadays, where people assume it's settled, so they are not interested in going back and reviewing, and there's a huge risk to that.
Yeah, so in a certain sense, what you're saying is quite important, because when I write an academic article presented a new chronology for the ancient world. It was a few years ago. And then as an outcome of that chronology, I showed that it supports the historicity of Abram. And just the fact that I tried to incorporate the idea of an historical Abram was just too far for some of them. One of the reviewers, he had no reason. He didn't give any arguments, but he just said, this piece, that's the one about Abram, should rather be left out.
Yeah.
So they're also afraid in the academic community, that if they were the one that gave the green light for something like that, the historical Abram, that's far-fetched. Nobody believes in it. How can you do something like that? So then, this is the kind of way that the scholarly community operate nowadays, especially in terms of biblical criticism. Obviously, we have traditional scholars at many universities all over the world, but in some way, these biblical criticism scholars, they are the ones that rules journals, they rules the conversation, or governs it. They are actually the ones in control. So let's have a look at Abram. Now, what is interesting about Abram, first of all, is the story about the Elamite incursion. And so the question is whether such an incursion had in fact taken place. That's the first question. I mean, the Bible tells about such an incursion during the period when Abram was already located or living in Canaan. Question is, did such an incursion happen? That's the question. Now, if such an incursion happened, how could the biblical author, writing in the 3rd century BC, they didn't have history books like us. This kind of history was not available.
You didn't Google it.
Nobody knew about it. In fact, scholars has only recently, about 20 years or less ago, have they discovered in Elam, that's the parts towards the east of the Persian Gulf, as they discovered cuneiform texts of the Elamites, in which a reference is made to this incursion towards Syria. So suddenly, not too long ago, this was not even, there was no facts on the ground proving this, but now we have solid proof that such an incursion took place.
Yeah.
So the question is, how on earth would the biblical author have known about it? if that wasn't the truth to do so. Saying the whole thing was made up 300 years before Christ. I mean, the author didn't have to Google, as you've just said. There was no Google to go and do some inquiries and research about history. This part of history was lost. Nobody knew about it. In fact, their view of history were quite limited. They had a good idea about certain things, but what we call secular history in our day, in the research and with archaeological data and so on to support it, that's what was not something that they even had the slightest idea about. So the fact that it indeed happened is quite important. Now, what is also important is to place it in the right context and to see when it happened. Now, I use, as I've said, my published chronology. I'm using this. But this chronology, the reason why I use it, let me first say this. In my view, this was the best way to explain ancient history. So it correlates in Mesopotamia. We have, let's say, 4 different chronologies. A high, a middle, a low, and a super low chronology. And in Egypt, we have basically 2 chronologies, a high and a low chronology. The question is, how should these be correlated? So what I argued in that article was that the Mesopotamian high chronology should be correlated with the Egyptian low chronology. Now, nobody has proposed this previously. I was the first to, as far as I know, to make this proposal. And at that stage, I had various arguments why that suits the history and explain things that other models couldn't explain, especially in terms of Egyptian history. And after my article was published, I discovered that recently in Germany, in a museum, an ancient cuneiform text had been located and had been translated. And this text, the Epic of Kulkishar, strongly confirms my chronological model. So then I actually wrote another piece, which was also published in a peer-reviewed journal, and which I just show that here is this dramatic evidence supporting the McLeod chronological model. Yeah. So what we have here is, if we just face the facts, I published the chronology. I didn't know about this evidence. On various regions, I believe this is the best chronology. Then afterwards, I found support. I mean, in this world that we're operating in the ancient Middle Eastern studies, these things do not happen this often. It happens, it's so scarce, it never happens. So here I have a model, and shortly afterwards, about 6 months later, I discovered this. It was published at about the same time, slightly before my article, but my article at that stage was already for some time at the journal, so we wrote it more or less the same time. So here I discovered proof strongly supporting. It's a long and technical discussion on how it works, but supporting this chronology. So now what I've said about Abram suddenly got totally different texture. Suddenly we have to look at different eyes with this, because now this chronology seems to be the correct one. And I haven't seen anybody showing anything that it's not been discussed. It's not been published so long ago, but I can tell you it will be very, very difficult to argue against this evidence. Now, in this chronology, I'm using the high Mesopotamian chronology. And in the high Mesopotamian chronology, the date for Abram coming from Haran, is 1836. That's the date let me first say, that's the date in the Septuagint. I'm going to use the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation being made about 250 years before Christ. So that's the date I'm using. That date says that Abram moved from Haran in 1836. Now, according to the high chronology, Mesopotamian high chronology, the Elamitic incursion took place in 1822. So here we have, on the one hand, we have 1836, the date when he moved from Haran and to Canaan and directly to Egypt. And on the other hand, we have this high chronology, 1822 was the date of the Elamite incursion. Now that's about 14 years later. Yeah. So it fits so beautifully with the Abrahamic story. 14 years after Abram has arrived in Canaan, this incursion took place. It fits beautifully.
Absolutely perfect. And you, in the article, you did mention the Septuagint as consistent with Kitchen's low chronology as well.
Yeah, that's the one for Egypt. That's the low chronology. Yeah. So now what is interesting is regarding, let me just say something else about this Elamite incursion. The Elamite incursion took place during the reign of an Elamite king called Sive Palar Hupak. And he was ruling in Elam. Elam is towards the east of the Persian Gulf. But it so happened that during that period, the leader of the Elamites, he actually ruled over Sumer. He was in control of Sumer. He was the overlord of Sumer. And what also happened was that his brother, Kuduzulu, was actually ruling in Sumer in the city of Ishnuna. That was where he was located. So it would have been him that would have led this incursion towards Syria and towards Canaan. Now, his name is Kuduzulu. And as I've said before, let's have a look at the name, the first part of the name, Kudu. And we've seen that the vowels change, but the consonants, that's the root of the name, stays the same. That's KD. And according to the Bible, this leader of this incursion was Kedorlaomer. Now, Kedor, if we take out the vowels, we again get KDR. So obviously, these names are closely in agreement. So this is strong support that the biblical story, it fits the correct period. The name of the leader is consistent, at least, insofar as the root of the name is concerned. And such an incursion took place in exactly the right period. Now, this is not strong evidence. You know, if you understand the ancient world, if you were a king in Egypt, and you had an inscription made on stone, then we will know about you. There was such a king, here's the inscription. And to some extent, the papyrus has also been preserved. But for most of the rest of the world, we use king lists. We have a little bit for later periods, from about, let's say, 1200, 1300 BC. We get more and more information. But before that, it's extremely difficult. There's not a lot of information available. Very few kings has left something that we can go and show and say, yeah, this king, this is his original inscription. It doesn't exist. It's just something that's so scarce. So if you want to have an understanding of the scarcity of this kind of information and evidence, I mean, then, in the light of that, this is strong evidence for an historical Abram.
You sound like you want to say, take that Babylonian hypothesis. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
So Carel, do you have anything to add to that? Because I would really like us to move on to just looking at Abram and his God, and perhaps those Sumerian and Akkadian influences.
It's just so sorry to add. It's just so encouraging, to know that there are strong evidence confirming this history in the Bible. So yes, but we can move on.
Yeah, Labai, I think we should not leave Abram that fast.
Okay. Absolutely. If you
Yeah,
today linger a bit more.
I think the discussion centers around Abram today. So let's spend some more time with Abram.
Yeah, maybe you did mention something about Egypt, that you also found evidence of Abraham in Egypt in some of the inscriptions there, because he went to Egypt when it was the famine. And it's that whole story, the king thought his wife, well, he said it was his sister to protect himself. It seems that it was a common problem. But anyway, there seems to be some evidence also you found there, Willie.
Yeah, so when we moved to Egypt, so whilst we use the high chronology for Mesopotamia, we're going to use the low chronology for Egypt, because this is the model. And it's been, the arguments for the model is not based on Abraham. I must just say this beforehand. It was based on totally different reasons and arguments. And I only included Abraham as an outflow after the discussion, but this is the implications for Hebrew history. I did not use Abraham at all in any part of the arguments. So what flows out of the arguments regarding Abraham was not part of the proofs and the arguments and so forth for the chronology. Now, so in this chronology, we're going to use the Egyptian low chronology. So in the Egyptian low chronology, there's a very interesting event taking place in 1836. Now, 1836 is the exact same year, according to the Septuagint, that Abram came from Haran. And when he entered Canaan, he immediately moved further because there was a famine to Egypt. Mm-hmm. So he came to Egypt in 1836. That's the same year. Now at Beni Hassan, we have an extremely interesting depiction. This depiction at Beni Hassan, it's found in the tomb of Knuhotep II. He was the administrator of the Eastern Desert. He had close relations with the royal court, the Egyptian court. And in his tomb, a man arriving with his entourage in Egypt called Abishai is shown. Now, why is this important? Because the name Abishai is just another form of the name of Abram. It's just another Amoritic form of the name used in the Bible called Abram, Abishai. Now, what is interesting about Abishai is that he arrives, according to this depiction, he arrived in the year 1836 in Egypt. He is shown with a group called the Asiatics of Shu. Now, Asiatics, that just refers to the Semites from the north, so Abram would be included. And the land of Shu was actually the region to the east of the Jordan River. So that's exactly the region from which Abram would have traveled towards Canaan and then towards Egypt. What is furthermore quite interesting is that he is shown arriving, bringing greeting gifts. With him shown is various persons, and he bring these gifts. And what is quite interesting, he is also called the ruler of the hill lands. Hill lands is just Canaan, which corresponds with the biblical notation calling Abram a mighty prince from Canaan. So he was a mighty prince coming from Canaan, moving en route via the area towards the east from the Jordan River, and he crossed there and came down to Egypt. So there's all of these designations that's exactly in correspondence with what we read about in the Bible. The Semites, the name Abishai, the exact same date, 1836. The close connections of Knuhotep II with the royal court, because in the biblical story, Abram's wife draw the attention of the Egyptian king. He being a ruler from the land of Canaan, as Abram is described as a mighty prince. What is also quite interesting is that the robes, the cloths that they're wearing is extremely interesting. It's beautifully colored, beautiful robes, and one author refers to it as patent stripes and chevrons. And this immediately reminds of the biblical story about Joseph and the robe that his father had made for him. So, and in this depiction, you can go and have a look on the internet, beautifully colored. So all of these things are consistent with the biblical story. It's in line. So this, I think, is quite fascinating. That he happens to come in the exact same year, having very much the same name. So I think, although this does not prove that this is in fact Abram, I think it provides strong supporting evidence. With Abram, with Abishar, was an entourage of about 37 men, it says in the inscription, 37 men, with their families. Some of them are shown in the depiction, and that's more or less what we also understand from the Bible, how large Abram's entourage could have been. So all of these things are consistent.
A strong synergy, just a very strong synergy.
Yeah, so if one knows how difficult it is to find supporting evidence for something like this in this period. You know, if you've studied that and you work with that every day, you'll have an understanding of what I'm saying. It's extremely difficult for most of the figures from that period. Great kings, we have so little evidence. We have maybe found some of the kings 1 or 2 seal cylinders or something, or seal impressions, or but more than that, and especially the further you go back in history, and the Abrahamic period, this period, 1836, that's a very difficult period to find. If you were not a pharaoh and you were a great king in Egypt, even the kings ruling in Canaan, only a few of them in this period are known to us. Only a few. So I think this is strong supporting evidence for an historical Abraham.
Carel, anything to add to that?
No, it's so amazing. I can just think, how difficult it would be to find evidence in the right point of time. So this is so encouraging. But if we talk about Abraham a little more, Abraham really seems to be a figure that connects two worlds. He grew up in Sumer, in Ur, and he moved down to Canaan. And, now the question is, how did he bring these stories and these traditions where he grew up? How did he bring it with him? Did he write it down? Was there already, I think the Sumerians were the first people to develop writing. Did Abraham actually write some of the parts of Genesis? How should we look at it? What do you think, Willie?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating topic again. Now, the city of Ur, where Abraham originated, according to the Bible, that was one of the cities with a long scribal tradition. It was a city where there were learned people, and a lot of them for the times. So I think we can have good reason to think that Abraham, and most likely also some of the people in his entourage coming with him, would have been able to read and write. If he was a leader, as we read in the Bible, and also as I've just mentioned, then he would surely, especially coming from Ur, such a city where learning was advanced and highly appreciated. Now, in my view, it's quite possible that these early stories were written down in the time of Abram. Now, the reason for thinking this, there's some good reason for that also. If one reads the Abrahamic story, one of the first things that you see is the amount of oracles. There's an enormous amount of oracle material within the book of Genesis. In chapter 12, in chapter 13, in chapter 15, in chapter 17, in chapter 18, in chapter 22, all over the place, we have these oracles that's been where God spoke to Abram. Now, when one reads this, it's just sort of, how do we know that God really spoke to Abram? But this is the point. In Mari, the city I've previously referred to where Abram traveled past, during this very same period, we have what let's call, it's typically called prophets in the tradition we're talking about. It's not biblical prophets, it's not true prophets, but a certain kind of prophets. But what is important here is that they wrote down the oracles of the gods. That was a habit. The reason for doing this was, other than today, they had an extreme awe for the divine. So if the gods spoke, it was so important, it had to be written down. That was the practice. We find that already in the Akkadian Empire, hundreds of years earlier, 500 years earlier, with the Akkadian kings. They, from time to time, for example, on a military expedition, they would stop and they would inquire the gods, what the god says, and they would look at the instantines of animals. They have priests traveling with them, and they would say, okay, the god says this, and so on. And then we have clay images made from that particular intestines that was read with the message. We have those things. It's been found. So it's so important to them. It was so important when the God spoke, it should be written down. So when we read about all these oracles given to Abram, there can be absolutely no doubt, given the habit of the time and the awe with which such oracles were regarded. And that's why it's written down, all these oracles, lots of them. All of them. There can be, in my view, there can't be any doubt that they had been written down already during the lifetime of Abram when they were given. That was when they were written down. So what I must add, in the Akkadian tradition, we find that the oracles were combined with the context, with the story, surrounding story, what happened with the king, etc. The same that we find with Abram. His story is combined with the oracles. How he traveled, how God spoke to him, what happened with him, how he came from Haran, how he went to Egypt. So this is exactly, the form that we have here is exactly the way that it had been done by the Semites in Mari and even much earlier in Mesopotamia. This gives us a good reason to believe that the story of Abram, the most basic parts at least, were written down, most likely in cuneiform. Alphabetic writing was not yet developed.
Just explain cuneiform, please.
Oh, that's the writing, on the clay. It looks like yeah, that's right. It's such a drawings on the clay, straight lines, with such a the instrument they used when they stopped, it made such a kind of, it had such a cuneiformic form.
It looked like the top of a little nail almost.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's where the name originates. It's cuneiform. So he would have written it down most likely in a cuneiform writing, and I would say in Akkadian, because he came from from Mesopotamia where they spoke Akkadian. It was not the same dialect that we find in Canaan. But he wouldn't have only written down that. He would have also written down and even brought earlier traditions that had been written down by his fathers with him when he came from Sumer. There was also a very strong oral tradition in that period. You know, before writing became every day, all of us use writing, and it's been for many hundreds and thousands of years like that. So when you can write something, you don't have to remember it. But if you do not write that often, it's important to remember. And there was a long period when these two went parallel, hand in hand, writing down things and remembering things, the oral tradition. So, for example, we find, I've referred to the Akkadian kings. Now, the founder of the Akkadian Empire was a man called Sargon the Great and mighty king. His daughter, Enheduanna, she's the first known author in history. She wrote 3 poems, beautiful poems. And in one of these poems, she advised the poets. And she says that you must repeat what I've said exactly and precisely. And the word used is a technical term. It should be done with exactness. And there was this long oral tradition, and poets had been trained for many years. So part of that tradition was the correct handing down of tradition. And this
so there was like a certain technique.
Exactly.
To keep it the exact words. Maybe that's also why, you know, in poetry, if it rhymes and there's a certain rhythm, it's much easier to remember it.
Yeah, we find later in Hebrew tradition, you know, the Jews to this day, many of them would learn the scriptures by heart. We have this strong oral tradition. And the prophet, who is it, Jeremiah, that speaks about the tables of the heart, writing it on the tables of the heart. So it's like the heart is a table and on it's written the text because it's remembered. This is a beautiful symbol. And they had this expression, the tables of the heart, and that's where we get it. It's like a cuneiform table on the heart because everything is written on the heart. It's remembered by heart. And so this is how, in Abraham's time, I believe, these earlier stories have already been written down, if not earlier. And then eventually, when it comes to the writing of the book of Genesis, which was much later, all of this data was used. Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, that really shows why Abraham is such a key figure, eh?
Absolutely.
He brought this information. That's why they can use it. Sorry, Lemay.
No, I was just saying it's wonderful how the Sumerian hypothesis actually ends up being a real starting point to understanding the Bible. It's that foundational, I want to say, key. But we're slowly running out of time. And I just quickly, Willie, did you want to say something about Abram and his God? And we can probably look at covering that more fully in another podcast.
Yeah, I think we should return to that because that's an extensive topic.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, we can come back to that. So I think for today, what is important is that Abram provides us not only with a link towards the ancient world, but in a certain sense, the historicity of everything that came after Abram is being questioned today. And once we restore the historicity of Abram, at the same time, we also restore the historicity of the rest of the biblical narrative. And historical Abram is extremely important for the argument in favor of the truthfulness and historicity of the Bible.
Absolutely. And on that note, I really want to go back and ask our listeners, if you find this of value and interesting, please like and share. The other comment I wanted to make is discuss it. You know, we don't back away from people that might not fully agree. It would actually be wonderful to hear people's opinions. But yeah, Carel, did you have any final thoughts?
Well, I can just say it was amazing for me to once again have a look at Abraham, the figure of Abraham. He is such a key person. Even the Jewish religion see him as the father of their religion, and even in Islam is also seen as the father of that religion. And for us Christians, we even in the New Testament is mentioned, we are children of Abraham, because God made a covenant with Abraham based on his faith. He was a man of faith, and in obedience he moved from his people to this strange new land where God provided for him and blessed him. And now we can thank him even more, for he brought important history with him that helps us today to prove that the Bible is indeed trustworthy and true. So yeah, it was good to look at Abraham.
Yeah. Thank you, Willie. I love these golden threads that just run through everything. It's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the next discussion. It's sort of building on it. And perhaps down the line, just getting into more depth as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Louis. It was a joy.
Our pleasure.